Apprehensive, however, lest spells or enchantments might be employed against him by priests who brought an unknown worship from a distant country, he had the precaution to receive them in the open air, where, he believed, the force of their magic would be more easily dissipated. Here Augustine, by means of his interpreters, delivered to him the tenets of the Christian faith, and promised him eternal joys above, and a kingdom in heaven without end, if he would be persuaded to receive that salutary doctrine. "Our words and promises," replied Ethelbert, "are fair, but because they are new and uncertain, I cannot entirely yield to them, and relinquish the principles which I and my ancestors have so long maintained. You are welcome, however, to remain here in peace, and as you have undertaken so long a journey, solely, as it appears, for what you believe to be for our advantage, I will supply you with all necessaries, and permit you to deliver your doctrine to my subjects." Augustine, encouraged by this favourable reception, and seeing now a prospect of success, proceeded with redoubled zeal to preach the gospel to the Kentish Saxons. He attracted their attention by the austerity of his manners, by the severe penances to which he subjected himself, by the abstinence, fine self-denial which he practised, and having excited their wonder by a course of life which appeared so contrary to nature, he procured more easily their belief of miracles, which, it was pretended, he wrought for their conversion. Influenced by these motives, and by the declared favour of the court, numbers of the Kentish men were baptized, and the king himself was persuaded to submit to that rite of Christianity. His example had great influence with his subjects, but he employed no force to bring them over to the new doctrine. Augustine thought proper, in the commencement of his mission, to assume the appearance of the greatest lenity. He told Ethelbert that the service of Christ must be entirely voluntary, and that no violence ought ever to be used in propagating so salutary a doctrine. The intelligence received of these spiritual conquests afforded great joy to the Romans, who now exulted as much in those peaceful trophies as their ancestors had ever done in their most sanguinary triumphs and most splendid victories. Gregory wrote a letter to Ethelbert, in which, after informing him that the end of the world was approaching, he exhorted him to display his zeal in the conversion of his subjects, to exert rigour against the worship of idols, and to build up the good work of holiness by every expedient of exhortation, terror, blandishment, or correction, a doctrine more suitable to that age, and to the usual papal maxims, than the tolerating principles which Augustine had thought it prudent to inculcate. The pontiff also answered some questions, which the missionary had put concerning the government of the new Church of Kent. Besides other queries, which it is not material here to relate, Augustine asked whether cousins German might be allowed to marry. Gregory answered that liberty had indeed been formerly granted by the Roman law, but that experience had shown that no issue could ever come from such marriages, and he therefore prohibited them. Augustine asked whether a woman pregnant might be baptized. Gregory answered that he saw no objection, how soon after the birth the child might receive baptism. It was answered, immediately if necessary, how soon a husband might have commerce with his wife after her delivery. Not till she had given suck to her child, a practice to which Gregory exhorts all women, how soon a man might enter the church or receive the sacrament after having had commerce with his wife. It was replied that unless he had approached her without desire, merely for the sake of propagating his species, he was not without sin, but in all cases it was requisite for him, before he entered the church or communicated, to purge himself by prayer and ablution, and he ought not, even after using these precautions, to participate immediately of the sacred duties. There are some other questions and replies still more indecent and more ridiculous, and on the whole it appears that Gregory and his missionary, if sympathy of manners have any influence, were better calculated than men of more refined understandings, for making a progress with the ignorant and barbarous Saxons. The more to facilitate the reception of Christianity, Gregory enjoined Augustine to remove the idols from the heathen altars, but not to destroy the altars themselves, because the people, he said, would be allured to frequent the Christian worship when they found it celebrated in a place which they were accustomed to revere. And as the pagans practiced sacrifices and feasted with the priests on their offerings, he also exhorted the missionary to persuade them, on Christian festivals, to kill their cattle in the neighbourhood of the church, and to indulge themselves in those cheerful entertainments to which they had been habituated. These political compliances show that, Notwithstanding his ignorance and prejudices, he was not unacquainted with the arts of governing mankind. Augustine was consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury, was endowed by Gregory with authority over all the British churches, and received the pall, a badge of ecclesiastical honour, from Rome. Gregory also advised him not to be too much elated with his gift of working miracles, and as Augustine, proud of the success of his mission, seemed to think himself entitled to extend his authority over the bishops of Gaul, the Pope informed him that they lay entirely without the bounds of his jurisdiction. The marriage of Ethelbert with Bertha, and much more his embracing Christianity, begat a connection of his subjects with the French, Italians, and other nations on the continent, and tended to reclaim them from that gross ignorance and barbarity in which all the Saxon tribes had been hitherto involved. Ethelbert also enacted, with the consent of the states of his kingdom, a body of laws, the first written laws promulgated by any of the northern conquerors, and his reign was in every respect glorious to himself and beneficial to his people. He governed the kingdom of Kent 50 years, and dying in 616, left the succession to his son Eadbald. This prince, seduced by a passion for his mother-in-law, deserted, for some time, the Christian faith, which permitted not these incestuous marriages. His whole people immediately returned with him to idolatry. Laurentius, the successor of Augustine, found the Christian worship wholly abandoned, and was prepared to return to France, in order to escape the mortification of preaching the gospel without fruit to the infidels. Mellitus and Justus, who had been consecrated bishops of London and Rochester, had already departed the kingdom, when Laurentius, before he should entirely abandon his dignity, made one effort to reclaim the king. He appeared before that prince, and, throwing off his vestments, showed his body all torn with bruises and stripes which he had received. Eadbald, wondering that any man should have dared to treat in that manner a person of his rank, was told by Laurentius that he had received this chastisement from St. Peter, the prince of the apostles, who had appeared to him in a vision, and severely reproving him for his intention to desert his charge, had inflicted on him these visible marks of his displeasure. Whether Eadbald was struck with the miracle, or influenced by some other motive, he divorced himself from his mother-in-law and returned to the profession of Christianity. His whole people returned with him. Eadbald reached not the fame or authority of his father, and died in 640, after a reign of 25 years, leaving 2 sons, Ermenfried and Ercombert. Ercombert, though the younger son, by Emma, a French princess, found means to mount the throne. He is celebrated by Bede for 2 exploits, for establishing the fast of Lent in his kingdom, and for utterly extirpating idolatry, which, notwithstanding the prevalence of Christianity, had hitherto been tolerated by the 2 preceding monarchs. He reigned 24 years, and left the crown to Egbert, his son, who reigned 9 years. This prince is renowned for his encouragement of learning, but infamous for putting to death his 2 cousins, German, sons of Ermenfrid, his uncle. The ecclesiastical writers praise him for his bestowing on his sister Donnuna some lands in the Isle of Thanet, where she founded a monastery. The bloody precaution of Egbert could not fix the crown on the head of his son Edric. Lothair, brother of the deceased prince, took possession of the kingdom, and in order to secure the power in his family, he associated with him Richard, his son, in the administration of the government. Edric, the dispossessed prince, had recourse to Edilwach, king of Sussex, for assistance, and being supported by that prince, fought a battle with his uncle, who was defeated and slain. Richard fled into Germany, and afterwards died in Lucca, a city of Tuscany. William of Malmesbury ascribes Lothair's bad fortune to 2 crimes, his concurrence in the murder of his cousins and his contempt for relics. Lothair reigned 11 years, Edric, his successor, only 2. Upon the death of the latter, which happened in 686, Widred, his brother, obtained possession of the crown. But as the succession had been of late so much disjointed by revolutions and usurpations, faction began to prevail among the nobility, which invited Cedwalla, king of Wessex, with his brother Mollo, to attack the kingdom. These invaders committed great devastations in Kent, but the death of Mollo, who was slain in a skirmish, gave a short breathing time to that kingdom. Widred restored the affairs of Kent, and, after a reign of 32 years, left the crown to his posterity. Eadbert, Ethelbert, and Alric, his descendants, successively mounted the throne. After the death of the last, which happened in 794, the royal family of Kent was extinguished, and every factious leader who could entertain hopes of ascending the throne threw the state into confusion. Egbert, who first succeeded, reigned but 2 years. Cuthred, brother to the king of Mercia, 6 years. Baldred, an illegitimate branch of the royal family, 18, and after a troublesome and precarious reign he was, in the year 823, expelled by Egbert, king of Wessex, who dissolved the Saxon heptarchy and united the several kingdoms under his dominion. The Kingdom of Northumberland. Adelfrid, king of Bernicia, having married Acca, the daughter of Ela, king of Deiri, and expelled her infant brother Edwin, had united all the counties north of Humber into one monarchy, and acquired a great ascendant in the heptarchy. He also spread the terror of the Saxon arms to the neighbouring people, and by his victories over the Scots and Picts, as well as Welsh, extended on all sides the bounds of his dominions. Having laid siege to Chester, the Britons marched out with all their forces to engage him, and they were attended by a body of 1,250 monks from the monastery of Bangor, who stood at a small distance from the field of battle in order to encourage the combatants by their presence and exhortations. Adelfrid, inquiring into the purpose of this unusual appearance, was told that these priests had come to pray against him. "Then are they as much our enemies," said he, "as those who intend to fight against us?" And he immediately sent a detachment, who fell upon them and did such execution that only 50 escaped with their lives. The Britons, astonished at this event, received a total defeat. Chester was obliged to surrender, and Adelfrid, pursuing his victory, made himself master of Bangor and entirely demolished the monastery, a building so extensive that there was a mile's distance from one gate of it to another, and it contained 2,100 monks who are said to have been there maintained by their own labour. Notwithstanding Adelfrid's success in war, he lived in inquietude on account of young Edwin, whom he had unjustly dispossessed of the crown of Deiri. This prince, now grown to man's estate, wandered from place to place, in continual danger from the attempts of Adelfrid, and received at last protection in the court of Redwald, king of the East Angles, where his engaging and gallant deportment procured him general esteem and affection. Redwald, however, was strongly solicited by the king of Northumberland to kill or deliver up his guest. Rich presents were promised him if he would comply, and war denounced against him in case of his refusal. After rejecting several messages of this kind, his generosity began to yield to the motives of interest, and he retained the last ambassador till he should come to a resolution in a case of such importance. Edwin, informed of his friend's perplexity, was yet determined at all hazards to remain in East Anglia, and thought that if the protection of that court failed him, it were better to die than prolong a life so much exposed to the persecutions of his powerful rival. This confidence in Redwald's honour and friendship, with his other accomplishments, engaged the Queen on his side, and she effectually represented to her husband the infamy of delivering up to certain destruction their royal guest, who had fled to them for protection against his cruel and jealous enemies. Redwald, embracing more generous resolutions, thought it safest to prevent Adelfrid before that prince was aware of his intention, and to attack him while he was yet unprepared for defence. He marched suddenly with an army into the kingdom of Northumberland, and fought a battle with Adelfrid, in which that monarch was defeated and killed, after revenging himself by the death of Regner, son of Redwald. His own sons, Eanfrid, Oswald and Oswy, yet infants, were carried into Scotland, and Edwin obtained possession of the crown of Northumberland. Edwin was the greatest prince of the heptarchy in that age, and distinguished himself both by his influence over the other kingdoms and by the strict execution of justice in his own dominions. He reclaimed his subjects from the licentious life to which they had been accustomed, and it was a common saying that during his reign a woman or child might openly carry everywhere a purse of gold, without any danger of violence or robbery. There is a remarkable instance transmitted to us of the affection borne him by his servants. Hume, king of Wessex, was his enemy, but finding himself unable to maintain open war against so gallant and powerful a prince, he determined to use treachery against him, and he employed one Hume for that criminal purpose. The assassin, having obtained admittance by pretending to deliver a message from Hume, drew his dagger and rushed upon the king. Lilla, an officer of his army, seeing his master's danger and having no other means of defence, interposed with his own body between the king and Berna's dagger, which was pushed with such violence that, after piercing Lilla, it even wounded Edwin. but before the assassin could renew his blow, he was dispatched by the king's attendants. The East Angles conspired against Redwald, their king, and having put him to death, they offered their crown to Edwin, of whose valour and capacity they had had experience, while he resided among them. But Edwin, from a sense gratitude towards his benefactor, obliged them to submit to Earpwald, the son of Redwald, and that prince preserved his authority, though on a precarious footing, under the protection of the Northumbrian monarch. Edwin, after his accession to the crown, married Ethelberga, the daughter of Ethelbert, King of Kent. This princess, emulating the glory of her mother Bertha, who had been the instrument for converting her husband and his people to Christianity, carried Paulinus, a learned bishop, along with her, and besides stipulating a toleration for the exercise of her own religion, which was readily granted her, she used every reason to persuade the king to embrace it. Edwin, like a prudent prince, hesitated on the proposal, but promised to examine the foundations of that doctrine, and declared that, if he found them satisfactory, he was willing to be converted. Accordingly, he held several conferences with Paulinus, canvassed the arguments propounded with the wisest of his counsellors, retired frequently from company in order to revolve alone that important question, and, after a serious and long inquiry, declared in favour of the Christian religion. The people soon after imitated his example. Besides the authority and influence of the king, they were moved by another striking example. Coifi, the high priest, being converted after a public conference with Paulinus, led the way in destroying the images which he had so long worshipped, and was forward in making this atonement for his past idolatry. This able prince perished with his son Osfrid in a great battle which he fought against Penda, king of Mercia, and Caedwalla, king of the Britons. That event, which happened in the 48th year of Edwin's age and 17th of his reign, divided the monarchy of Northumberland, which that prince had united in his person. Eanfrid, the son of Adelfrid, returned with his brothers Oswald and Oswy from Scotland, and took possession of Bernicia, his paternal kingdom. Osric, Edwin's cousin german, established himself in Derry, the inheritance of his family, but to which the sons of Edwin had a preferable title. Eanfrid, the elder surviving son, fled to Penda, by whom he was treacherously slain. The younger son, Vuskfrea, with Ifi, the grandson of Edwin, by Osfrid, sought protection in Kent, and not finding themselves in safety there, retired into France to King Dagobert, where they died. Osric, king of Derry, and Eanfrid of Bernicia returned to paganism, and the whole people seemed to have returned with them, since Paulinus, who was the first Archbishop of York, and who had converted them, thought proper to retire with Ethelberga, the Queen Dowager, into Kent. Both these Northumbrian kings perished soon after, the first in battle against Caedwalla, the Briton, the second by the treachery of that prince. Oswald, the brother of Eanfrid, of the race of Bernicia, united again the kingdom of Northumberland in the year 634, and restored the Christian religion in his dominions. He gained a bloody and well-disputed battle against Caedwalla, the last vigorous effort which the Britons made against the Saxons. Oswald is much celebrated for his sanctity and charity by the monkish historians, and they pretend that his relics wrought miracles, particularly the curing of a sick horse, which had approached the place of his interment. He died in battle against Penda, king of Mercia, and was succeeded by his brother Oswy, who established himself in the government of the whole Northumbrian kingdom, by putting to death Oswin, the son of Osric, the last king of the race of Derry. His son Ecgfrid succeeded him, who, perishing in battle against the Picts without leaving any children, because Adelthrid, his wife, refused to violate her vow of chastity. Alfred, his natural brother, acquired possession of the kingdom, which he governed for 19 years, and he left it to Osrid, his son, a boy of 8 years of age. This prince, after a reign of 11 years, was murdered by Kenred, his kinsman, who, after enjoying the crown only a year, perished by a like fate. Osric, and after him Celwulf, the son of Kenred, next mounted the throne, which the latter relinquished in the year 738 in favour of Edbert, his cousin german, who, imitating his predecessor, abdicated the crown and retired into a monastery. Oswulf, son of Edbert, was slain in a sedition a year after his accession to the crown, and Mollo, who was not of the royal family, seized the crown. He perished by the treachery of Aelred, a prince of the blood, and Aelred, having succeeded in his design upon the throne, was soon after expelled by his subjects. Ethelred, his successor, the son of Mollo, underwent a like fate. Selwold, the next king, the brother of Aelred, was deposed and slain by the people, and his place was filled by Osred, his nephew, who, after a short reign of a year, made way for Ethelbert, another son of Mollo, whose death was equally tragical with that of almost all his predecessors. After Ethelbert's death, a universal anarchy prevailed in Northumberland, and the people having, by so many fatal revolutions, lost all attachment to their government and princes, were well prepared for subjection to a foreign yoke, which Egbert, King of Wessex, finally imposed upon them. The Kingdom of East Anglia. The history of this kingdom contains nothing memorable except the conversion of Earpwold, the fourth king, and great-grandson of Una, the founder of the monarchy, the authority of Edwin, King of Northumberland, on whom that prince's entirety depended, engaged him to take this step. But soon after, his wife, who was an idolatress, brought him back to her religion, and he was found unable to resist those allurements which have seduced the wisest of mankind. After his death, which was violent, like that of most of the Saxon princes that did not early retire into monasteries, Sigebert, his successor and half-brother, who had been educated in France, restored Christianity and introduced learning among the East Angles. Some pretend that he founded the University of Cambridge, or rather some schools in that place. It is almost impossible, and quite needless, to be more particular in relating the transactions of the East Angles. What instruction or entertainment can it give the reader to hear a long bead roll of barbarous names, Egric, Annas, Ethelbert, Ethelwald, Aldulf, Elfwald, Bjorn, Ethelred, Ethelbert, who successively murdered, expelled, or inherited from each other, and obscurely filled the throne of that kingdom? Ethelbert, the last of these princes, was treacherously murdered by Offa, king of Mercia, in the year 792, and his state was thenceforth limited with that of Offa, as we shall relate presently. The Kingdom of Mercia, the largest, if not the most powerful, kingdom of the Heptarchy, comprehended all the middle counties of England, and as its frontiers extended to those of all the other kingdoms, as well as to Wales, it received its name from that circumstance. Wibba, the son of Creda, founder of the monarchy, being placed on the throne by Ethelbert, King of Kent, governed his paternal dominions by a precarious authority, and after his death, Ceol, his kinsman, was, by the influence of the Kentish monarch, preferred to his son Penda, whose turbulent character appeared dangerous to that prince. Penda was thus 50 years of age before he mounted the throne, and his temerity and restless disposition were found nowise abated by time, experience, or reflection. He engaged in continual hostilities against all the neighbouring states, and, by his injustice and violence, rendered himself equally odious to his own subjects and to strangers. Sigebert, Egric, and Annas, 3 kings of East Anglia, perished successively in battle against him, as did also Edwin and Oswald, the 2 greatest princes that had reigned over Northumberland. At last, Oswy, brother to Oswald, having defeated and slain him in a decisive battle, freed the world from this sanguinary tyrant. Pieda, his son, mounted the throne of Mercia in 655, and lived under the protection of Oswy, whose daughter he had espoused. This princess was educated in the Christian faith, and she employed her influence with success in converting her husband and his subjects to that religion. Thus, the fair sex have had the merit of introducing the Christian doctrine into all the most considerable kingdoms of the Saxon Heptarchy. Pieda died a violent death. His son Wulfhere succeeded to the government, and, after having reduced to dependence the kingdoms of Essex and East Anglia, he left the crown to his brother Ethelred, who, though a lover of peace, showed himself not unfit for military enterprises. Besides making a successful expedition into Kent, he repulsed Egfrid, king of Northumberland, who had invaded his dominions, and he slew in battle Elswin, the brother of that prince. Desirous, however, of composing all animosities with Egfrid, he paid him a sum of money as a compensation for the loss of his brother. After a prosperous reign of 30 years, he resigned the crown to Kendred, son of Wulfhere, and retired into the monastery of Bardney. This prince, who mounted the throne in 755, had some great qualities, and was successful in his warlike enterprises against Lothair, King of Kent, and Kenwulf, King of Wessex. He defeated the former in a bloody battle at Otford upon the Darron, and reduced his kingdom to a state of dependence. He gained a victory over the latter at Bensington in Oxfordshire, and conquering that county, together with that of Gloucester, annexed both to his dominions. But all these successes were stained by his treacherous murder of Ethelbert, king of the East Angles, and his violent seizing of that kingdom. This young prince, who is said to have possessed great merit, had paid his addresses to Elfrida, the daughter of Offa, and was invited with all his retinue to Hereford, in order to solemnize the nuptials. Amidst the joy and festivity of these entertainments, he was seized by Offa, and secretly beheaded. And though Elfrida, who abhorred her father's treachery, had time to give warning to the East Anglian nobility, who escaped into their own country, Offa, having extinguished the royal family, succeeded in his design of subduing that kingdom. The perfidious prince, desirous of re-establishing his character in the world, and perhaps of appeasing the remorses of his own conscience, paid great court to the clergy, and practised all the monkish devotions so much esteemed in that ignorant and superstitious age. He gave the tenth of his goods to the church, bestowed rich donations on the cathedral of Hereford, and even made a pilgrimage to Rome, where his great power and riches could not fail of procuring him the papal absolution. The better to ingratiate himself with the sovereign pontiff, he engaged to pay him a yearly donation for the support of an English college at Rome, and in order to raise the sum, he imposed a tax of a penny on each house possessed of 30 pence a year. This imposition, being afterwards levied on all England, was commonly denominated Peter's pence, and though conferred at first as a gift, was afterwards claimed as a tribute by the Roman pontiff. Carrying his hypocrisy still further, Offa, feigning to be directed by a vision from heaven, discovered at Verulam the relics of St. Alban, the martyr, and endowed a magnificent monastery in that place. Moved by all these acts of piety, Malmesbury, one of the best of the Old English historians, declares himself at a loss to determine whether the merits or crimes of this prince preponderated. Offa died, after a reign of 39 years, in 794. This prince was become so considerable in the Heptarchy that the Emperor Charlemagne entered into an alliance and friendship with him, a circumstance which did honour to Offa, as distant princes at that time had usually little communication with each other. That emperor being a great lover of learning and learned men, in an age very barren of that ornament, Offa, at his desire, sent him over Alcuin, a clergyman much celebrated for his knowledge, who received great honours from Charlemagne, and even became his preceptor in the sciences. The chief reason why he had at first desired the company of Alcuin was that he might oppose his learning to the heresy of Felix, Bishop of Urgel, in Catalonia, who maintained that Jesus Christ, considered in his human nature, could more properly be denominated the adoptive than the natural Son of God. This heresy was condemned in the Council of Frankfurt, held in 794, and consisting of 300 bishops. Such were the questions which were agitated in that age, and which employed the attention not only of cloistered scholars, but of the wisest and greatest princes. Egfrith succeeded to his father Offa, but survived him only 5 months, when he made way for Cenulf, a descendant of the royal family. This prince waged war against Kent, and taking Egbert the king prisoner, he cut off his hands and put out his eyes, leaving Cuthred, his own brother, in possession of the crown of that kingdom. Cenulf was killed in an insurrection of the East Anglians, whose crown his predecessor Offa had usurped. He left his son Kenelm, a minor, who was murdered the same year by his sister Quendrad, who had entertained the ambitious views of assuming the government. But she was supplanted by her uncle Ceolulf, who, 2 years after, was dethroned by Beowulf. The reign of this usurper, who was not of the royal family, was short and unfortunate. He was defeated by the West Saxons and killed by his own subjects, the East Angles. Ludican, his successor, underwent the same fate, and Wiglaf, who mounted this unstable throne and found everything in the utmost confusion, could not withstand the fortune of Egbert, who united all the Saxon kingdoms into one great monarchy, the kingdom of Essex. This kingdom made no great figure in the Heptarchy, and the history of it is very imperfect. Slader succeeded to his father, Ercinwin, the founder of the monarchy, and made way for his son Sebert, who, being nephew to Ethelbert, king of Kent, was persuaded by that prince to embrace the Christian faith. His sons and conjunct successors, Sexted and Seward, relapsed into idolatry, and were soon after slain in a battle against the West Saxons. To show the rude manner of living in that age, Bede tells us that these 2 kings expressed great desire to eat the white bread distributed by Mellitus, the bishop, at the communion. But on his refusing them, unless they would submit to be baptized, they expelled him their dominions. The names of the other princes who reigned successively in Essex are Sigebert the Little, Sigebert the Good, who restored Christianity, Swithelm, Sigeri, Offa. This last prince, having made a vow of chastity, notwithstanding his marriage with Cenna, a Mercian princess, daughter to Penda, went in pilgrimage to Rome and shut himself up during the rest of his life in a cloister. Ceolred, his successor, reigned 38 years, and was the last of the royal line, the failure of which threw the kingdom into great confusion and reduced it to dependence under Mercia. Swithred first acquired the crown by the concession of the Mercian princes, and his death made way for Sigeric, who ended his life in a pilgrimage to Rome. His successor, Sigered, unable to defend his kingdom, submitted to the victorious arms of Egbert. The Kingdom of Sussex. The history of this kingdom, the smallest in the Heptarchy, is still more imperfect than that of Essex. Ella, the founder of the monarchy, left the crown to his son Cissa, who is chiefly remarkable for his long reign of 76 years. During his time, the South Saxons fell almost into a total dependence on the kingdom of Wessex, and we scarcely know the names of the princes who were possessed of this titular sovereignty. Adalwalch, the last of them, was subdued in battle by Ceodwalla, king of Wessex, and was slain in the action, leaving 2 infant sons, who, falling into the hand of the conqueror, were murdered by him. The abbot of Bedford opposed the order for this execution, but could only prevail on Ceodwalla to suspend it till they should be baptized. Berchthun and Ordum, 2 noblemen of character, resisted some time the violence of the West Saxons, but their opposition served only to prolong the miseries of their country, and the subduing of this kingdom was the first step which the West Saxons made towards acquiring the sole monarchy of England. The Kingdom of Wessex. The Kingdom of Wessex, which finally swallowed up all the other Saxon states, met with great resistance on its first establishment, and the Britons, who were now inured to arms, yielded not tamely their possessions to those invaders. Ceolfrith, the founder of the monarchy, and his son Kenric fought many successful and some unsuccessful battles against the natives, and the martial spirit, common to all the Saxons, was, by means of these hostilities, carried to the greatest height among this tribe. Ceolin, who was the son and successor of Kenric, and who began his reign in 560, was still more ambitious and enterprising than his predecessors, and by waging continual war against the Britons, he added a great part of the counties of Devon and Somerset to his other dominions. Carried along by the tide of success, he invaded the other Saxon states in his neighbourhood, and becoming terrible to all, he provoked a general confederacy against him. This alliance proved successful under the conduct of Ethelbert, King of Kent, and Ceolin, who had lost the affections of his own subjects by his violent disposition, and had now fallen into contempt from his misfortunes, was expelled the throne and died in exile and misery. Cuichelm and Cuthwin, his sons, governed jointly the kingdom till the expulsion of the latter in 591 and the death of the former in 593 made way for Ceolric, to whom succeeded Ceobard in 593, by whose death, which happened in 611, Cynegils inherited the crown. This prince embraced Christianity through the persuasion of Oswald, king of Northumberland, who had married his daughter, and who had attained a great ascendant in the Heptarchy. Cenwalch next succeeded to the monarchy, and dying in 672 left the succession so much disputed that Sexburga, his widow, a woman of spirit, kept possession of the government till her death, which happened 2 years after. Esgwin then peaceably acquired the crown, and, after a short reign of 2 years, made way for Kentwin, who governed 9 years. Ceodwalla, his successor, mounted not the throne without opposition, but proved a great prince, according to the ideas of those times, that is, he was enterprising, warlike, and successful. He entirely subdued the kingdom of Sussex and annexed it to his own dominions. He made inroads into Kent, but met with resistance from Widrid the king, who proved successful against Mollo, brother to Ceodwalla, and slew him in a skirmish. Ceodwalla at last, tired with wars and bloodshed, was seized with a fit of devotion, bestowed several endowments on the church, and made a pilgrimage to Rome, where he received baptism and died in 689. Ina, his successor, inherited the military virtues of Ceodwalla and added to them the more valuable ones of justice, policy, and prudence. He made war upon the Britons in Somerset, and, having finally subdued that province, he treated the vanquished with a humanity hitherto unknown to the Saxon conquerors. He allowed the proprietors to retain possession of their lands, encouraged marriages and alliances between them and his ancient subjects, and gave them the privilege of being governed by the same laws. These laws he augmented and ascertained, and though he was disturbed by some insurrections at home, his long reign of 37 years may be regarded as one of the most glorious and most prosperous of the Heptarchy. In the decline of his age, he made a pilgrimage to Rome, and after his return, shut himself up in a cloister where he died. Though the kings of Wessex had always been princes of the blood, descended from Cerdic, the founder of the monarchy, the order of succession had been far from exact, and a more remote prince had often found means to mount the throne, in preference to one descended from a nearer branch of the royal family. Ina, therefore, having no children of his own, and lying much under the influence of Ethelbert, his queen, left by will the succession to Adelard, her brother, who was his remote kinsman, but this destination did not take place without some difficulty. Oswald, a prince more nearly allied to the crown, took arms against Adelard, but, he being suppressed, and dying soon after, the title of Adelard was not any further disputed, and in the year 741 he was succeeded by his cousin Coudray. The reign of this prince was distinguished by a great victory, which he obtained by means of Edelhun, his general, over Ethelbert, king of Mercia. His death made way for Sigebert, his kinsman, who governed so ill that his people rose in an insurrection and dethroned him, crowning Cenulf in his stead. The exiled prince found a refuge with Duke Cumbran, governor of Hampshire, who, that he might add new obligations to Sigebert, gave him many salutary counsels for his future conduct, accompanied with some reprehensions for the past. But these were so much resented by the ungrateful prince that he conspired against the life of his protector and treacherously murdered him. After this infamous action he was forsaken by all the world, and skulking about in the wilds and forests was at last discovered by a servant of Cumbran's, who instantly took revenge upon him for the murder of his master. Cenulf, who had obtained the crown on the expulsion of Sigebert, was fortunate in many expeditions against the Britons of Cornwall, but afterwards lost some reputation by his ill success against Offa, king of Mercia. Kynehard also, brother to the deposed Sigebert, gave him disturbance, and though expelled the kingdom, he hovered on the frontiers and watched an opportunity for attacking his rival. The king had an intrigue with a young woman who lived at Merton in Surrey, whither having secretly retired, he was on a sudden environed in the night time by Kynehard and his followers, and after making a vigorous resistance was murdered with all his attendants. The nobility and people of the neighbourhood, rising next day in arms, took revenge on Kynehard for the slaughter of their king, and put everyone to the sword who had been engaged in that criminal enterprise. This event happened in 784. Berthric next obtained possession of the government, though remotely descended from the royal family, but he enjoyed not that dignity without inquietude. Eopa, nephew to King Ina by his brother Ingild, who died before that prince, had begot Eta, father to Alkmund, from whom sprung Egbert, a young man of the most promising hopes, who gave great jealousy to Brithric, the reigning prince, both because he seemed by his birth better entitled to the crown, and because he had acquired to an eminent degree the affections of the people. Egbert, sensible of his danger from the suspicions of Brithric, secretly withdrew into France, where he was well received by Charlemagne. By living in the court and serving in the armies of that prince, the most able and most generous that had appeared in Europe during several ages, he acquired those accomplishments which afterwards enabled him to make such a shining figure on the throne. And familiarizing himself to the manners of the French, who, as Malmesbury observes, were eminent both for valour and civility above all the Western nations, he learned to polish the rudeness and barbarity of the Saxon character. His early misfortunes thus proved of singular advantage to him. It was not long ere Egbert had opportunities of displaying his natural and acquired talents. Brithric, king of Wessex, had married Edburga, natural daughter of Offa, king of Mercia, a profligate woman, equally infamous for cruelty and for incontinence. Having great influence over her husband, she often instigated him to destroy such of the nobility as were obnoxious to her, and where this expedient failed, she scruples not being herself active in traitorous attempts against them. She had mixed a cup of poison for a young nobleman who had acquired her husband's friendship, and had on that account become the object of her jealousy, but unfortunately the king drank of the fatal cup along with his favourite, and soon after expired. This tragical incident, joined to her other crimes, rendered Edburga so odious that she was obliged to fly into France, whence Egbert was at the same time recalled by the nobility in order to ascend the throne of his ancestors. He attained that dignity in the last year of the 8th century. In the kingdoms of the Heptarchy, an exact rule of succession was either unknown or not strictly observed, and thence the reigning prince was continually agitated with jealousy against all the princes of the blood, whom he still considered as rivals, and whose death alone could give him entire security in his possession of the throne. From this fatal cause, together with the admiration of the monastic life and the opinion of merit attending the preservation of chastity even in a married state, the royal families had been entirely extinguished in all the kingdoms except that of Wessex, and the emulations, suspicions, and conspiracies, which had formerly been confined to the princes of the blood alone, were now diffused among all the nobility in the several Saxon states. Egbert was the sole descendant of those first conquerors who subdued Britain, and who enhanced their authority by claiming a pedigree from Woden, the supreme divinity of their ancestors. But that prince, though invited by this favourable circumstance to make attempts on the neighbouring Saxons, gave them for some time no disturbance, and rather chose to turn his arms against the Britons in Cornwall, whom he defeated in several battles. He was recalled from the conquest of that country by an invasion made upon his dominions by Bernulf, king of Mercia. The Mercians, before the accession of Egbert, had very nearly attained the absolute sovereignty in the Heptarchy. They had reduced the East Angles under subjection, and established tributary princes in the kingdoms of Kent and Essex. Northumberland was involved in anarchy, and no state of any consequence remained but that of Wessex, which, much inferior in extent to Mercia, was supported solely by the great qualities of its sovereign. Egbert led his army against the invaders, and encountering them at Ellandun in Wiltshire, obtained a complete victory, and by the great slaughter which he made of them in their flight, gave a mortal blow to the power of the Mercians. Whilst he himself, in prosecution of his victory, entered their country on the side of Oxfordshire, and threatened the heart of their dominions, he sent an army into Kent, commanded by Ethelwulf, his eldest son, and, expelling Baldred, the tributary king, soon made himself master of that county. The kingdom of Essex was conquered with equal facility, and the East Angles, from their hatred to the Mercian government, which had been established over them by treachery and violence, and probably exercised with tyranny, immediately rose in arms and craved the protection of Egbert. Bernulf, the Mercian king who marched against them, was defeated and slain, and 2 years after, Ludican, his successor, met with the same fate. These insurrections and calamities facilitated the enterprises of Egbert, who advanced into the centre of the Mercian territories and made easy conquests over a dispirited and divided people. In order to engage them more easily to submission, he allowed Wiglaf, their countryman, to retain the title of king, whilst he himself exercised the real powers of sovereignty. The anarchy which prevailed in Northumberland tempted him to carry still farther his victorious arms, and the inhabitants, unable to resist his power, and desirous of possessing some established form of government, were forward, on his first appearance, to send deputies, who submitted to his authority, and swore allegiance to him as their sovereign. Egbert, however, still allowed to Northumberland, as he had done to Mercia and East Anglia, the power of electing a king who paid him tribute and was dependent on him. Thus were united all the kingdoms of the Heptarchy in one great state, near 400 years after the first arrival of the Saxons in Britain, and the fortunate arms and prudent policy of Egbert at last effected what had been so often attempted in vain by so many princes. Kent, Northumberland, and Mercia, which had successively aspired to general dominion, were now incorporated in his empire, and the other subordinate kingdoms seemed willingly to share the same fate. His territories were nearly of the same extent with what is now properly called England, and a favourable prospect was afforded to the Anglo-Saxons of establishing a civilized monarchy, possessed of tranquillity within itself and secure against foreign invasion. This great event happened in the year 827. The Saxons, though they had been so long settled in the island, seem not as yet to have been much improved beyond their German ancestors, either high arts, civility, knowledge, humanity, justice, or obedience to the laws. Even Christianity, though it opened the way to connections between their and the more polished states of Europe, had not hitherto been very effectual in banishing their ignorance or softening their barbarous manners. As they received that doctrine through the corrupted channels of Rome, It carried along with it a great mixture of credulity and superstition, equally destructive to the understanding and to morals. The reverence towards saints and relics seems to have almost supplanted the adoration of the Supreme Being. Monastic observances were esteemed more meritorious than the active virtues. The knowledge of natural causes was neglected. From the universal belief of miraculous interpositions and judgments, bounty to the Church atoned for every violence against society, and the remorses for cruelty, murder, treachery, assassination, and the more robust vices were appeased, not by amendment of life, but by penances, servility to the monks, and an abject and illiberal devotion. The reverence for the clergy had been carried to such a height that, wherever a person appeared in a sacerdotal habit, though on the highway, the people flocked around him, and, showing him all marks of profound respect, received every word he uttered as the most sacred oracle. Even the military virtues, so inherent in all the Saxon tribes, began to be neglected, and the nobility, preferring the security and sloth of the cloister to the tumults and glory of war, valued themselves chiefly on endowing monasteries, of which they assumed the government. The several kings, too, being extremely impoverished by continual benefactions to the Church, to which the states of their kingdoms had weakly assented, could bestow no rewards on valour or military services, and retained not even sufficient influence to support their government. Another inconvenience which attended this corrupt species of Christianity was the superstitious attachment to Rome, and the gradual subjection of the kingdom to a foreign jurisdiction. The Britons, having never acknowledged any subordination to the Roman pontiff, had conducted all ecclesiastical government by their domestic synods and councils, but the Saxons, receiving their religion from Roman monks, were taught at the same time a profound reverence for that see, and were naturally led to regard it as the capital of their religion. Pilgrimages to Rome were represented as the most meritorious acts of devotion. Not only noblemen and ladies of rank undertook this tedious journey, but kings themselves, abdicating their crowns, sought for a secure passport to heaven at the feet of the Roman pontiff. New relics, perpetually sent from that endless mint of superstition and magnified by lying miracles, invented in convents, operated on the astonished minds of the multitude. And every prince has attained the eulogies of the monks, the only historians of those ages, not in proportion to his civil and military virtues, but to his devoted attachment towards their order and his superstitious reverence for Rome. The sovereign pontiff, encouraged by this blindness and submissive disposition of the people, advanced every day in his encroachments on the independence of the English churches. Wilfrid, Bishop of Lindisfarne, the sole prelate of the Northumbrian kingdom, increased this subjection in the 8th century by his making an appeal to Rome against the decisions of an English synod which had abridged his diocese by the erection of some new bishoprics. Agatho, the Pope, readily embraced this precedent of an appeal to his court, and Wilfrid, though the haughtiest and most luxurious prelate of his age, having obtained with the people the character of sanctity, was thus able to lay the foundation of this papal pretension. The great topic by which Wilfrid confounded the imaginations of men was that Saint Eupa, Peter, to whose custody the keys of heaven were entrusted, would certainly refuse admittance to everyone who should be wanting in respect to his successor. This conceit, well suited to vulgar conceptions, made great impression on the people during several ages, and has even at present lost all influence in the Catholic countries. Had this abject superstition produced general peace and tranquillity, it had made some atonement for the ills attending it. But besides the usual avidity of men for power and riches, frivolous controversies in theology were engendered by it, which were so much the more fatal as they admitted not, like the others, of any final determination from established possession. The disputes, excited in Britain, were of the most ridiculous kind, and entirely worthy of those ignorant and barbarous ages. There were some intricacies, observed by all the Christian churches, in adjusting the day of keeping Easter, which depended on a complicated consideration of the course of the sun and moon. And it happened that the missionaries, who had converted the Scots and Britons, had followed a different calendar from that which was observed at Rome in the age when Augustine converted the Saxons. The priests also of all the Christian churches were accustomed to shave part of their head, but the form given to this tonsure was different in the former from what was practiced in the latter. The Scots and Britons pleaded the antiquity of their usages. The Romans and their disciples, the Saxons, insisted on the universality of theirs. That Easter must necessarily be kept by a rule, which comprehended both the day of the year and age of the moon, was agreed by all. That the tonsure of a priest could not be omitted without the utmost impiety was a point undisputed, but the Romans and Saxons called their antagonists schismatics because they celebrated Easter on the very day of the full moon in March, if that day fell on a Sunday, instead of waiting till the Sunday following, and because they shaved the forepart of their head from ear to ear, instead of making that tonsure on the crown of the head and in a circular form. In order to render their antagonists odious, they affirmed that once in 7 years they concurred with the Jews in the time of celebrating that festival, and that they might recommend their own form of tonsure. They maintained that it imitated symbolically the crown of thorns worn by Christ in his passion, whereas the other form was invented by Simon Magus without any regard to that representation. These controversies had, from the beginning, excited such animosity between the British and Romish priests that, instead of concurring in their endeavours to convert the idolatrous Saxons, they refused all communion together, and each regarded his opponent as no better than a pagan. The dispute lasted more than a century, and was at last finished, not by men's discovering the folly of it, which would have been too great an effort for human reason to accomplish, but by the entire prevalence of the Romish ritual over the Scotch and British. Wilfrid, Bishop of Lindisfarne, acquired great merit, both with the court of Rome and with all the southern Saxons, by expelling the Quartodeciman Schism, as it was called, from the Northumbrian kingdom, into which the neighbourhood of the Scots had formerly introduced it. Theodore, Archbishop of Canterbury, called in the year 680 a synod at Hatfield, consisting of all the bishops in Britain, where was accepted and ratified the decree of the Lateran Council, summoned by Martin, against the heresy of the Monothelites. The council and synod maintained, in opposition to these heretics, that, though the divine and human nature in Christ made but one person, yet had they different inclinations, wills, acts, and sentiments, and that the unity of the person implied not any unity in the consciousness. This opinion, it seems somewhat difficult to comprehend, and no one, unacquainted with the ecclesiastical history of those ages, could imagine the height of zeal and violence with which it was then inculcated. The decree of the Lateran Council calls the Monothelites impious, execrable, wicked, abominable, and even diabolical, and curses and anathematizes them to all eternity. Chapter 2. The Saxons, from the first introduction of Christianity among them, had admitted the use of images, and perhaps that religion, without some of those exterior ornaments, had not made so quick a progress with these idolaters, but they had not paid any species of worship or address to images, and this abuse never prevailed among Christians till it received the sanction of the Second Council of Nice, Egbert. The kingdoms of the Heptarchy, though united by a recent conquest, seemed to be firmly cemented into one state under Egbert, and the inhabitants of the several provinces had lost all desire of revolting from that monarch, or of restoring their former independent governments. Their language was everywhere nearly the same, their customs, laws, institutions, civil and religious, and as the race of the ancient kings was totally extinct in all the subjected states, the people readily transferred their allegiance to a prince who seemed to merit it by the splendour of his victories, the vigour of his administration, and the superior nobility of his birth. A union also in government opened to them the agreeable prospect of future tranquillity, and it appeared more probable that they would thenceforth become formidable to their neighbours than be exposed to their inroads and devastations. But these flattering views were soon overcast by the appearance of the Danes, who, during some centuries, kept the Anglo-Saxons in perpetual inquietude, committed the most barbarous ravages upon them, and at last reduced them to grievous servitude. The Emperor Charlemagne, though naturally generous and humane, had been induced by bigotry to exercise great severities upon the pagan Saxons in Germany, whom he subdued, and besides often ravaging their country with fire and sword, he had, in cool blood, decimated all the inhabitants for their revolts, and had obliged them, by the most rigorous edicts, to make a seeming compliance with the Christian doctrine. That religion, which had easily made its way among the British Saxons by insinuation and address, appeared shocking to their German brethren when imposed on them by the violence of Charlemagne, and the more generous and warlike of these pagans had fled northward into Jutland in order to escape the fury of his persecutions. Meeting there with a people of similar manners, they were readily received among them, and they soon stimulated the natives to concur in enterprises which both promised revenge on the haughty conqueror and afforded subsistence to those numerous inhabitants with which the northern countries were now overburdened. They invaded the provinces of France, which were exposed by the degeneracy and dissensions of Charlemagne's posterity, and being there known under the general name of Normans, which they received from their northern situation, they became the terror of all the maritime and even of the inland countries. They were also tempted to visit England in their frequent excursions, and being able, by sudden inroads, to make great progress over a people who were not defended by any naval force, who had relaxed their military institutions, and who were sunk into a superstition which had become odious to the Danes and ancient Saxons, they made no distinction in their hostilities between the French and English kingdoms. Their first appearance in this island was in the year 787, when Brithric reigned in Wessex. A small body of them landed in that kingdom, with a view of learning the state of the country, and when the magistrate of the place questioned them concerning their enterprise, and summoned them to appear before the king, and account for their intentions, they killed him, and, flying to their ships, escaped into their own country. The next alarm was given to Northumberland in the year 794, when a body of these pirates pillaged the monastery, but their ships being much damaged by a storm, and their leaders slain in a skirmish, they were at last defeated by the inhabitants, and the remainder of them put to the sword. 5 years after Egbert had established his monarchy over England, the Danes landed in the Isle of Sheppey, and having pillaged it, escaped with impunity. They were not so fortunate in their next year's enterprise, when they disembarked from 35 ships, and were encountered by Egbert at Charmouth in Dorsetshire. The battle was bloody, but though the Danes lost great numbers, they maintained the post which they had taken, and thence made good their retreat to their ships. Having learned, by experience, that they must expect a vigorous resistance from this warlike prince, they entered into an alliance with the Britons of Cornwall, and, landing 2 years after in that country, made an inroad with their confederates into the county of Devon, but were met at Hengersdown by Egbert and totally defeated. While England remained in this state of anxiety, and defended itself more by temporary expedients than by any regular plan of administration, Egbert, who alone was able to provide effectually against this new evil, unfortunately died, and left the government to his son Ethelwulf. This prince had neither the abilities nor the vigour of his father, and was better qualified for governing a convent than a kingdom. He began his reign with making a partition of his dominions, and delivering over to his eldest son, Athelstan, the new conquered provinces of Essex, Kent, and Sussex. But no inconveniences seem to have arisen from this partition, as the continual terror of the Danish invasions prevented all domestic dissension. A fleet of these ravagers, consisting of 33 sail, appeared at Southampton, but were repulsed with loss by Wulfhere, governor of the neighbouring country. The same year, Ethelhelm, governor of Dorsetshire, routed another band which had disembarked at Portsmouth, but he obtained the victory after a furious engagement, and he bought it with the loss of his life. Next year, the Danes made several inroads into England, and fought battles, or rather skirmishes, in East Anglia and Lindsey and Kent, where, though they were sometimes repulsed and defeated, they always obtained their end of committing spoil upon the country and carrying off their booty. They avoided coming to a general engagement, which was not suited to their plan of operations. Their vessels were small, and ran easily up the creeks and rivers, where they drew them ashore, and, having formed an entrenchment round them, which they guarded with part of their number, the remainder scattered themselves everywhere, and carrying off the inhabitants, and cattle and goods, they hastened to their ships and quickly disappeared. If the military force of the county were assembled, for there was no time for troops to march from a distance, the Danes either were able to repulse them and to continue their ravages with impunity, or they betook themselves to their vessels, and, setting sail, suddenly invaded some distant quarter, which was not prepared for their reception. Every part of England was held in continual alarm, and the inhabitants of one county durst not give assistance to those of another, lest their own families and property should in the meantime be exposed by their absence to the fury of these barbarous ravagers. All orders of men were involved in this calamity, and the priests and monks, who had been commonly spared in the domestic quarrels of the Heptarchy, were the chief objects on which the Danish idolaters exercised their rage and animosity. Every season of the year was dangerous, and the absence of the enemy was no reason why any man could esteem himself a moment in safety. These incursions had now become almost annual, when the Danes, encouraged by their successes against France as well as England, for both kingdoms were alike exposed to this dreadful calamity, invaded the last in so numerous a body as seemed to threaten it with universal subjection.